The White Pill is available now at whitepillbook.com. This episode is brought to you by Patriot Gold. Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be our welcome for the next hour. We have with us a very special episode with two buddies of mine who are going to be discussing a sensitive and newsworthy topic, what's going on over there in Israel. Now, we're recording this on Wednesday. It's going to air a week from now. And hopefully by the time that happens, I'm not holding my breath. Things will have reached a peaceful, happy resolution for everyone involved. So let me introduce my guests here. We got Dave Smith, who's obviously no stranger to the show, and Will Chamberlain, who's been the show before. Will, you are a senior counsel at, I love this organization, at the Internet. I want to get the exact title right. Internet Accountability Project. I like, Will, that you're really leaning into this whole dad look. You got the
yeah, we got the crib in the background.
the playpen behind you, the polo. You've given up on shaving. It's just like, all right, like I'm a dad. Okay, I'm not. This is happening. All right, it's like I tried to fight it, but now here we are. I do want to point out we're all Jewish, and this is going to be a discussion, not a debate, because when people have debates, there's an incentive not to kind of concede points and people dig in their heels. And I'm more interested in getting to some kind of information and truth rather than dunking and wins. And I think especially when a subject like this is so sensitive. And the other issue is this topic, as with many other topics, people have so many mousetraps in their heads that you say certain terms, they just deliver these speeches, and you're not ending up listening to anyone, and nothing positive happens as a consequence. I'm going to try to avoid that here as well. We didn't even sit down and discuss how this is going to go, so I'm just going to lead through just some basic issues, and I think we're going to have a fruitful resolution. And I would just want to start with Dave. You know, Dave is much more of the anti-Zionist position. Will is a Zionist as well. But just very briefly, like, I see this term Zionist, Dave, used as a pejorative. My understanding of the term Zionist just simply meant that Israel has a right to exist. Doesn't mean that Israel can't be criticized. Doesn't mean that Israel, never does anything wrong. Do you disagree with that definition?
I mean, I think a slightly more precise definition would be the belief that the Jewish people ought to have a Jewish state in the area of Israel. But I wouldn't describe myself necessarily in theory an anti-Zionist. I'm a libertarian. I believe if a group of people want to organize and form their own government and have it be a Jewish state, I don't inherently have anything against that. My beef with Israel is more the violation of rights of others. So that would be the thing. By the way, can I just say before we do all this, I just apologize to everybody. I'm under the weather, and so if I sound gross or I blow my nose throughout all of this, I apologize for that. Although it could maybe be viewed as kind of like heroic that I even showed up today, a Jordan with the flu type situation. Anyway, keep that in mind.
In all fairness, me and Will did poison your well, so I think this is a consequence of what happened there. No, I agree with that definition. That's why I see a lot of people who identify as anti-Zionist. I'm like, do you know what you're saying? You're just okay. So the first question I also want to ask you more broadly: what would have been or what you would have liked to have seen Israel do as a response to the events of October 7th?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're obviously, I'd like to have seen different things done well before that.
Sure.
But as a response to October 7th, I think there was an enormous opportunity, much like the United States of America had after 9/11, where you had things like, in Tehran, they had candlelight vigils for the victims of 9/11 and stuff. And so what you would have liked to see, I think, is, as Scott said during your debate with him, Will, that you would have liked to see a response from Israel that would have been more in line with their traditional anti-terrorism responses pre-Netanyahu, where it was much more focused on individually targeting terrorists. Not that there would be zero violence or no innocent people die in that, but this unbelievable assault of Gaza over the last several weeks has been, you know, I would say has shown a large disregard for innocent human life. And I think it's done a lot to, even from the pro-Zionist perspective, it's been a real strategic blunder where it has turned so much of the global opinion against Israel in a way that I've never seen before. So, I mean, I would also have liked to see the response being to like, have a real investigation about how exactly this was, the most the most secured fortress in the world was allowed to be hit this way by the most surveilled area in the world in Gaza, and fortification of borders and so forth. But I think it could have been a real opportunity for Israel. Again, not saying that there wouldn't be any violence in their response, but it could have been a real opportunity for them to kind of demonstrate that they do care about the innocent life in Palestinian territories, and that they really were committed to an actual peace process.
Yeah, Will, let me get your thoughts on that. Doesn't this whole idea of like eye for an eye and one-upping the violence just lead to like mass death on all sides, something which none of us are in favor of?
Well, I mean, I think this is a little different in terms of. I mean, we'll start with the comparison between this and 9/11, where in Tehran you had people holding candlelight vigils, and just generally the overwhelming sympathy was with Iran. The really interesting thing in terms of the global reaction was before Israel even responded to 10/7, you had mass Muslim protests all over the world against Israel, which is really concerning. And I think this is something that both Scott and other libertarians I've seen haven't really grappled with, because the way I describe what Hamas did was Hamas did a loomer, right? This is in the worst possible way. It's a stunt, right? And the goal was not necessarily
I'm sorry, what was
blowback.
What was the word that you
Loomering.
described it at?
I like Laura Loomer, right? Like this is
okay. Yes.
global.
I get it now. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So it's a stunt. Okay.
Okay.
And the idea being that
I'm
it's
sorry. I'm
not
sorry. I have
the
to
whole.
interject. I have to interject as the host, right?
Yeah.
All of us, I'm
Okay.
sure, find it
They just handcuff themselves to Israel.
Yes, all of us find it excruciating when people are like, climate change is like the Holocaust, right? So, like, to compare what's being done to
Okay.
these kids and women to Laura Loomer, who is a friend of the show.
All right. Fair enough. It's a little bit mean to Laura Loomer.
facetiously,
I'm not a huge fan of
but
her personally, which allows me to do that, but you're right.
sure, but come on.
But in any event, I want to get to let me explain
Yes.
what the basic logic here is, right? Hamas wasn't even doing it to inspire blowback to get people angry at Israel, because remember, people were immediately angry at Israel. Hamas's strategy was just to get attention, just to get people to think about Israel again. And all of a sudden, literally doing this unbelievably barbaric terrorist attack got everybody to just think and hate Israel and be like, oh yeah, we hate Israel too. Mass protests in the streets before any response. So I guess I think that problematizes the blowback thesis, because it's basically in a world where people can, an organization like Hamas can do something so barbaric as October 7th and get a positive response from the Muslim, street more broadly, means that like we really shouldn't care that much about blowback, because it's just, otherwise we are basically incentivizing barbarism. And ultimately that also creates another argument on that point, which is it becomes very important that Hamas lose, because in a world where a barbaric stunt on the nature of 10/7, right? Like where you can just, mass murder 1,200 people, and that actually is a net positive for your movement, that can't be, right? That can't stand, because then we're going to get a lot more of that. This isn't the same as like, oh, we have to fight them over there, so we don't fight them over here. It's more this particular strategy by Hamas should lead to the destruction of their organization, because if it doesn't, it will be more widely adopted. And that would be really horrible for the world more broadly.
Dave, let me ask this. Like, I'm thinking Margaret Thatcher and the Falklands, when the Argentinian junta, which is a fascist gang, invaded the Falklands. They held them, and Reagan, Al Haig, Secretary of State, were like, "Let's have a diplomatic solution." She goes, "We can have diplomacy once the status quo is reinstated, but if we are letting them take any inch, this creates an incentive." And that's just going to have consequences down the road. You know very well that when you create incentives for people, they will follow them, often with negative consequences. What do you think of that thought of Will's? Is like, if they are allowing Hamas to, like, they had a ceasefire, that's going to validate Hamas hostage taking, no?
Well, I mean, look, there certainly are some problematic incentives here, right? And so I don't deny any of that. But I think that the problem, a couple things. First of all, it doesn't discredit the theory of blowback at all if the Muslim world celebrates an attack. That doesn't logically follow. And the fact that to not look at the history of the situation between Israel and the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine in general, is just, if you're going to ignore all of that, and we just started October 7th and kind of don't recognize that this is in response to something, I think you're just not really getting at the real conversation. Now, the problem with Will saying, and I get his point, I'm not saying there's nothing to this. It is certainly true that pretty immediately after the attack of October 7th, there were people who were condemning what Israel was about to do in response to this. Now, you're overstating your case quite a bit when you say it was everyone. In fact, all of the most powerful halls of power immediately condemned the attack. I would say the vast majority of regular people certainly were horrified by the attack of October 7th. But there were some groups of people who were saying, watch what Israel's about to do now. They're going to start slaughtering innocent people in Gaza. The problem is that they then did do that. So it makes it a lot harder to look at those people and say, oh, this was totally wrong of you to anticipate what did follow. And just all I'm saying is, imagine the thought experiment that if Israel hadn't done that, then a lot of those people would have looked pretty foolish. And it would have been much easier to turn global opinion maybe against them and to have an opportunity. And again, you're right that it's not an apples to apples comparison to 9/11. But it does, at least, like, there is an analogy there where you go, just imagine if in response to 9/11 that the United States of America had done the special ops campaigns in Afghanistan, taken out the Al-Qaeda cells there. Imagine they had actually trapped Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora when they had the opportunity and seemed to have let him escape into Pakistan. And let's say we got Osama bin Laden at the end and it's wrapped up by the end of 2001. And then we just stepped back and just kind of even lectured the Muslim world about how backward and barbaric so much of their civilizations are, and not went on a 20-year mass murder campaign through multiple different Muslim countries. I'm just saying that there was an opportunity here to maybe take this global opinion that is so against you and turn it back in your favor. I'm not saying that this is all one or the other. I'm not saying that there aren't people out there who just hate Jews and would celebrate no matter what. There obviously are some number of them, but I think opinion could have dramatically been shifted in Israel's favor, and instead they've turned the highest percentage of the world against them that I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm 40.
Folks, did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? So if you wake up too hot or too cold, I highly recommend you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. They're inspired by NASA, and Miracle Made uses silver-infused fabrics and makes temperature-regulating bedding so you can sleep at night with the perfect temperature all night long. These sheets are infused with silver that prevents up to 99.7% of bacterial growth. It lets them stay cleaner and fresher up to 3 times longer than other sheets. No more gross odors. They're comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands, and they feel as nice, if not nicer, than sheets used by 5-star hotels. And Miracle Sheets are the perfect gift for your spouse, friends, or family. And since these come with 3 free towels, that's right, you get 2 gifts in one just in time for the holidays. Go to trymiracle.com/malice to try today or gift it to somebody special this holiday season. And we've got a special deal for our listeners. Save over 40%. And if you use promo code MALICE at checkout, you get 3 free towels and save an additional 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you aren't 100% satisfied, you get a full refund. So upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/malice. Use code MALICE at checkout to claim your 3-piece towel set for free and save up 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/malice to treat yourself, a friend, or a loved one this holiday season. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, well, let me ask this. As a Zionist, that no matter what Israel does, a huge percentage of, not so to say, a large percentage of people are going to view it through the worst possible light. So doesn't that put an impetus on the Israeli government to kind of bend over backwards to do everything by the book and cross their T's and dot their I's, so that otherwise it can't be exploited and used to foment greater hatred, not just against Israel, but against Jews worldwide?
I mean, to a degree, right? And I think they have done that to a pretty large extent. I don't recall us, giving a 2-week heads up to any of the cities we were dealing with when we were going after ISIS and telling everybody they need to evacuate, and then not really kickstarting the invasion for 2 weeks. That's a pretty dramatic thing. And I mean, all that talk about, oh, it's impossible for people to evacuate. I mean, it was it was roughly evacuating 10 miles. I mean, honestly, the kind of thing that, even in the worst possible circumstance, you could walk that in 5 to 6 hours. Obviously it's still a war zone, which is not ideal, but in terms of, the grand scheme of difficult evacuations, I don't think it was one. But I also want to get back to addressing Dave's point, which is this sort of the kind of American response to 9/11 contrasted with the Israeli response to Hamas. So I think there's two big differences that are relevant. The first is Al-Qaeda was a lot smaller than Hamas in terms of numbers. Right. Al-Qaeda was maybe 1,000 people in Afghanistan, something in that neighborhood. Hamas is like 30 or 50,000 in the Gaza Strip. I don't know exactly what the numbers, but that's, I think, the number of people they have under arms. Second difference is where they are, right? Afghanistan, they're off in the remote hill tribal regions. So going after them, you can use a lot of ordnance and not hit any civilians ever, or very, very few, right? I mean, you're bombing mountains. Gaza, Hamas basically built a castle underneath the city. That's the way I look at it. It's like you built your military fortifications underneath the city, and that's where you're hanging out. So if we want to go after you, that poses a very, very challenging thing to avoid civilian casualties more generally. And then, so I think that's why the sort of this is what I told Scott, the kind of mark and reprisal approach, if you will, I don't think solves the puzzle, right? Say even they take out a few of the senior leaders in Qatar and they take out a few more senior leaders in Gaza. Well, there's still the enormous terrorist infrastructure underneath Gaza City. There's still 32,000 people under arms. There's still all the rockets, all of that, which they basically are able to make life in southern Israel completely untenable. And as a result, I don't think the 9/11 strategy is remotely feasible for Israel. And there's also there's an additional dynamic, which is because Israel is such a small country, because of this endless, incessant rocket fire from something so close, right on the border. If Israel doesn't deal with it, doesn't put an end to that, they end up kind of, people, it's just going to be a mass exodus, right? People are just going to leave because you wouldn't want to live in a place constantly under rocket fire and where your government wouldn't answer it, where your government wouldn't put a stop to it. And I think that I think ultimately, while you might be talking about global public opinion having shifted anti-Israeli, internal Israeli public opinion is unbelievably solid, and that includes the Israeli left. They're basically uniformly in agreement that Hamas has got to go, and that what the government is doing is the way to get Hamas out.
Dave,
and so I think that those distinctions really mean that I think the Israeli government's response is appropriate.
Yeah,
well,
Dave, Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Please.
Well, I don't deny that there's been after October 7th, there's been a rally around the flag effect in Israel. But again, I don't know how much you can really extrapolate from that. I mean, yes, George W. Bush had the highest approval ratings in presidential history. Netanyahu is not enjoying that. But yes, there is, after you're hit in such an egregious way, there is going to be a lot of people rallying around, let's go get those guys. I think our job is to try to, as people who are not citizens of that country, but are citizens of the United States of America, to try to have cooler heads prevail and kind of think this situation through. But I would say that I think that your good friend Daryl Cooper, who's done really amazing work on, and I really highly recommend his very long podcast series on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I would look at some of the stuff that he's put out about this. And look, there was just a big piece in the New York Times the other day. I'll give you the title. Was "We are no strangers to human suffering, but we've seen nothing like the siege of Gaza." And there's basically they highlight these 6 people have gone to all types of different war zones and seen all of them. And so it's just, I don't think accurate that this is just they're fighting in a way that is preserving innocent life as much as possible. And yes, there's been some leaflets and some warnings to evacuate, but I'm sure, Will, you read the 972 magazine expose on this, where they kind of detailed how exactly this war is being conducted, and what was written in the New York Times seems to perfectly jive with what they said in that expose, that there's actually been enormous disregard for innocent civilians, and that's why the numbers have been stacking up so quickly. And in fact, it's actually even part of the strategy of the latest Israel offensive to kind of make life as miserable for people in Gaza as they can, in order to put pressure on Hamas. Kind of a similar type strategy with with sanction campaigns, where basically the idea is to bring them to the table to overthrow their own government, which is never actually seems to work. I would just say, zooming out a little bit, I think that I understand the perspective, and believe me, I understand the pro-Israeli perspective. I was raised in the pro-Israeli perspective. That it's like, look, there is this threat. There are rockets coming in. We can't just live with this threat. And that I understand that, but it's only one side of the story. And the other side of the story, more broadly speaking, is that a lot of people in the Palestinian territories also have a right to say, we can't live under this status quo. And the way Daryl Cooper puts it, which I really thought was like the kind of the best analogy, none of these are ever perfect, but it's kind of like if in America, when we had the Japanese internment camps during World War II, we put these Japanese in these internment camps, and let's say they started to resist, and they started to throw rocks at some of the tanks outside, and they started to try to tear down the fence. And then we sent in tanks and military, and we kind of, took care of them. And then there was just this cycle where throughout the next few years, there were violent uprisings and then military actions where a lot of people got killed. And this cycle just kind of continued. And then you zoom forward to 2023, and they're still there. We still have them in these Japanese internment camps because we've never let them go. And now the overwhelming majority of people in these camps grew up there. It's the only life they've ever known. And yes, anti-American sentiment has really risen. And their parents are telling them stories about how awful the Americans have been to them from when they're little kids. And the American perspective was like, well, we can't let them out of the camps now because it's too much of a real threat. It's too, like, they hate us too much. Who knows what they're going to do? And I think most of us would recognize in that situation that it's just self-evidently unacceptable that the answer is that we'll just keep them in these camps. And that at some point, you just have to let them go. And like whatever the result of that is, then you can have a new conversation about that. But the current state in Gaza and in the West Bank is that Israel won a war in 1967 and has dominated them ever since. And there's at this point, they're not even pretending that there's a peace process or that there's any type of plan where someday they'll be given their autonomy or their independence or their own state. It's just like, well, this is life. You have to accept it. You have no natural rights. And that's not going to work. And October 7th is evidence of that.
Will?
Yeah. So, I mean, we can talk about the West Bank in a second, but let's talk about Gaza, right? I'm not talking about, not post 10/7. I'm talking about, pre 10/7 Gaza. I think comparing it to a prison camp is just this wild hyperbole that comes from both Scott and others. It was a city. You can't leave Gaza to go into Israel without a permit. Yeah, there's a really good reason for that. I mean, you go back to the Second Intifada, suicide terrorism, etc. But there's no Israeli troops in Gaza. There are no Israeli policemen in Gaza. Gaza is run by Hamas, and if Gaza is a prison camp, that's because Hamas is the government responsible for making it a prison camp, ultimately. Like, they're the people responsible for day-to-day interactions. To the extent that Israel is involved, it's with blockades of certain materiel. But in terms of, you think about all the money, think about the critique you regularly level of Netanyahu, which is that he facilitated or allowed aid from Qatar to go in to Gaza. Well, we're talking billions and billions of dollars in aid, properly administered by a Hamas that was actually interested in the well-being of the Palestinian people.
Why did he want
Gaza would not be a
in?
prison camp. It would be Singapore.
Sure. So can I just ask like a couple questions? So number one, because it seems like almost the way you're describing it is, are you saying there's already a two-state solution there, that Gaza is a state?
I'm saying that Gaza has a lot of, pre 10/7, Gaza had a ton of autonomy. Like, remember again, 2005, Israel withdrew its troops and presence. It dismantled its settlements. It took all Jews out. There are no troops there, right? There is like surveillance and the occasional drone, obviously, to attack a particular target. But like the general, the Israeli footprint on the ground in Gaza is extraordinarily limited. Like, they don't enter except in like a formal, almost like a formal military operation.
But why is it, Will, why do you think that all of the international human rights groups, like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or all these groups, why did they all say that the occupation never ended and that this is still an occupied territory? Because even though Israel pulled out the IDF, and so yes, Gaza since 2005 has not been under martial law, and worse than martial law, like foreign martial law, so yes, that's been the case, but they've still maintained complete control on everything that comes in, everything that goes out, the airspace, the sea space. They don't allow them, their own people to fish more than a few feet off of their own coastline. They regulate the amount of energy and electricity. I'm sorry, repeating myself, the amount of electricity, the utilities, the amount of medical care that can get in. Israel has complete control of it. So no, a prison is not a perfect description, but it is undeniably still dominated by Israel. They've been under siege by Israel this entire time. And that's why there's so much outrage about this in the international community.
I mean, I don't have much respect for Amnesty and these other groups in general. So I don't I just don't respect them. So I don't take their analysis of this with much seriousness. And I guess I would say on the front of Israel letting in stuff, yeah, Israel has to stop weapons from going in, because again, the fundamental problem is they won't stop shooting rockets at civilian territory. So there's a basic fundamental responsibility Israel has to protect its own citizens. Now,
but then wouldn't the Palestinians Okay.
Oh, no, you can go. That's enough of a point that you
okay.
can
So, but what it really comes down to here is just who has the power to exert their will on the other side, because you could just as easily make an argument that the Palestinians have a responsibility to not allow weapons to come into Israel, because those weapons are also used against them, but in much greater number, and much more people die. And so we always look at it from this one perspective of like, oh, well, Israel can't allow Palestine to have their freedom because they could do bad things with their freedom. The same argument could be used for the Palestinians. Of course, they just don't have the power to do anything about that. The point is that Israel does not have the moral right to say you don't get your freedom because we think that could be risky to us. And that's what people are objecting to. These people have been dominated by Israel since 1967. And that's just totally unreasonable. And it seems like, Will, like from your debate with Scott, that you're not saying that like, oh, I favor a one-state solution or I favor a two-state solution. You're basically saying that what you favor is that, yeah, this is it in perpetuity. You guys do not get your freedom. That you're going to basically be probably occupied by Israel or dominated by Israel, or perhaps you can leave and we can ethnically cleanse the area, but they just don't get their liberty. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'd say liberty and sovereignty are different things, right?
Well,
liberty is individual and your individual rights. I would say that I love the Palestinians to have as much liberty as feasible but they don't get sovereignty, right? They don't get military sovereignty, because I think that's the core difference, right? I mean, if you think about what is preventing the Gaza people from having meaningful liberty, it's not Israel, it's Hamas, right? It's the terrorist organization that enforces the personal rights. What is preventing Hamas from having sovereignty is Israel. And I'd like to put this point to you, and this is something that, I feel like, you look at every other state surrounding Israel, the broader constellation of Arab states in the Middle East, and extraordinarily critical of them. And it's like the one state you're fond of is the hypothetical Palestinian state, right? Like that's the one state that has yet to do wrong. That's the one state that has yet to like do this. Like the world where, even in a world, because if you actually look at what Hamas has done in Gaza, even in a world where Israel is gone, the liberty of the actual Palestinian people would be extraordinarily limited. The difference would be they would be ruled tyrannically by someone who shared their ethnicity, right? And I don't see that as like meaningful liberty, one. And then I think two, the consequences of doing that would obviously be like extraordinarily devastating for the Israelis. So I don't see the idea of giving anything resembling full sovereignty to the people of Gaza who elected Hamas, or effectively giving sovereignty to Hamas, is a terrifying idea. And that, I guess I'll connect it with one final point, which is, I think I've seen you say, like, you agree that Hamas needs to go, right? You don't see a world where there can be a meaningful two-state solution with Hamas. Okay, so then I think Israel agrees, and that's sort of the idea. Whether or not we get a two-state solution, if everybody's in agreement Hamas needs to go for a variety of reasons, okay, well, all roads lead to Rome, we still should get rid of Hamas.
Folks, as you get older, after a night with drinks, you don't bounce back the next day like you used to. So you have to make a choice. Either you can have a great night or a great next day, and that's where Z-Biotics comes in. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. So ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. It's designed to work like your liver, but in your gut where you need it most. Just remember to drink ZBiotics before drinking alcohol, drink responsibly, and get a good night's sleep to feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/malice to get 15% off your first order when you use Malice at checkout. You can also sign up for a subscription using my code so you can stay prepared no matter the time or occasion. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee. If you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/malice and use code Malice at checkout for 15% off. And thank you, ZBiotics, for sponsoring this episode. Michael Malice here, author, podcast host, and yes, underwear model. Santa's not the only one with something in his pouch. That's where Sheath underwear comes in, because Sheath is the only underwear that I wear. And what makes Sheath special is that it has 2 pouches for both parts of your male anatomy. First time you try it on, you're going to be like, this is weird. And then you won't be able to live without it. It was developed because the head of Sheath served time overseas, and being in the desert was not exactly fun for your boy parts. And that's where Sheath underwear came in. I designed 1 pair, sold out. Now working on another pair. I love my Sheath. I wear it every day. And all you have to do is go to sheathunderwear.com now. Use promo code Malice. You get 20% off. They've also got bamboo shirts. They've got hoodies. Sheath also uses materials like bamboo and mesh for even more cooling comfort. They also have a women's line. I don't know what goes in where, but since no women watch the show, it's kind of a moot point. Guys, go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code MALICE for 20% off, and you can get inside my pants. Ho, ho, ho. Let's get back to the show.
Well,
let me jump in here because I got a couple. Hold on,
sure. Go ahead.
I got a question that I think for both of you. I'll ask Dave first, because when I look at this issue, I look at it from in a context that I'm much more familiar with, which is the Korean War, right? And no one is saying the great leader Kim Il-sung, founder of North Korea, is a good guy, to put it mildly. Syngman Rhee was certainly preferable to him, but he was hardly an angel who was installed as head of South Korea. But during the Korean War, you had Kim Il-sung, Mao and Stalin in the north, and you had the U.S. and the UN in the south backing up the South Korean government. And the Korean people were the ones who paid the price. And the country was leveled, and the devastation was horrible, and it ended kind of in a draw. It seems like, from the outside looking in, as someone who is much more of a casual observer than I think either of you, that neither the Israeli government nor Hamas cares very much for the population in Gaza and is concerned about. They're just kind of being used as a cudgel to further 2 differing agendas. I would love to know from each of you if you think that what I just said is incorrect, and I'll start with Dave.
No, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that both Hamas and the Israeli government do not care about innocent Palestinians being killed, and I think that's kind of the crux of the issue. I will just say that Will's, what I had said was that you'd want to see like negotiations between these 2 people, and that's probably not very likely as long as Hamas and the Likud party are in charge, and that if you'd want to see like a younger generation of leadership rise up where there was more goodwill to actually talk and negotiate. There's been points in the not that distant past where there was more goodwill toward at least starting that process. And I think now it's at a very bad point. But to Will, I think this is just kind of a straw man of what I believe in terms of saying, like, I'll criticize all of these other Arab states, but I say the people in Gaza have done no wrong. That's not my claim at all. It's clearly, there's been a lot of wrong done on both sides. The major difference here is like, what is actually the catalyst that is driving this? And it is like, let me say it like this, because I get accused a lot in these type of debates from right-wingers of who will say things like, well, you're just an always blame America. It's always America's fault, or it's always Israel's fault. And I hope I make this clear. In my heart of hearts, I am a crotchety right-winger. Like, I am a Western chauvinist. And how could I not be? I'm a libertarian. How could a libertarian not think that Western civilization is better than every other civilization? It's the only civilization where a conception of liberty has ever existed. And all of the things that I love, like property rights and non-aggression and all of this stuff, the idea of individual rights comes out of Western civilization. And I'd be quite happy to just sit around and point out how barbaric and primitive the rest of the world is, because they don't do liberty right the way we do in the Western world. The problem is that our government and the governments that they prop up keep screwing over these people to a point where that's all you can't ignore that. And so, like, in the same sense that the United States of America was a much better place to live than Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And obviously, if we were like a non-interventionist country and we were just talking about Iraq's under Saddam Hussein, all I'd have to say is that what a nightmare of authoritarianism that is, and how much better it is to live over here. But when we fund Saddam Hussein in the 1980 war to go kill 500,000 Iranians and give him a bunch of chemical weapons, and then we start a war with his country in 1991 over a bullshit slant drilling dispute, and then we tell the Kurds to rise up and overthrow him, and then we bail out of backing them up, so he slaughters them by the hundreds of thousands, and then our politicians lie to us about weapons of mass destruction, so we invade the country again, and then my comment after that can't just be like, oh, well, these people are so primitive over there in Iraq. The comment is like, well, why does our corrupt government keep fucking these people over? And so that's kind of my point. To your question, if they were given their autonomy and given their statehood, do I think it would be like some type of Jeffersonian limited constitutional government? No, probably not. But you still don't have a right to not give that to them. It's simply that simple. You don't have a right to do that.
So I think here's an interesting analogy. Like, it's almost like a mirror image, right? Think about the Kurds in Iraq. Nobody thinks of the Kurds in Iraq as occupied, even though they're an own distinct people that nominally should have self-determination in the north, right? They've been oppressed routinely by the Iraqis in the south, but nobody thinks of Kurdistan as occupied Kurd territory. It's a very interesting dynamic, right? And the funny thing is, I was reading a lot of international law and about like what is occupied territory, and Israel is this like, it's like all the international organizations have like done some like casuistry and bizarre reasoning to try and make it so that the West Bank and Gaza, well, Gaza not anymore, but at least the West Bank is like occupied territory. And so explain, I forget the name exactly of this principle, but there's a principle of international law that developed in the post-colonial world that said, what are the boundaries going to be of the post-colonial state, where they're, the default says they're going to be the boundaries of the pre-colonial organization or the pre-colonial territory. And so in that case, like, for example, like the borders of the current Jordan are the borders of the Transjordan Mandate, the board, like, et cetera. And there's a good reason for this principle. It provides a default rule to solve border disputes and reduce conflict over those. It ensures there isn't what's called terra nullius, which is just territory that doesn't belong to anybody, that nobody has sovereign responsibility for. So that principle, because no Palestinian state ever emerged out of the partition, right? That principle would suggest like Israel has a legit claim to the West Bank and Gaza because that was the prior boundaries of the British Mandate, and that it's not occupied territory. And that logic would lead to, in the sense of like, if everybody just agreed all the territory belonged to Israel, right? That leads to less war. The problem is it's like everybody sort of has decided and agreed that, unlike in other places like Kurdistan or Nagorno-Karabakh or you name it, where you have a nationalized people that people that consider themselves a nation but don't have a state. In those places, those people aren't recognized as having sovereignty, and their sovereign is not occupying their territory. And I mean, obviously, you still get some conflicts, but I think the point being that if you were trying to maximize the amount of conflict in the world, right, and trying to maximize the amount of war, you would say that you would be looking for ways to say that the people who have sovereign control of the territory are actually occupying it, and that a people that don't even have a state, that never had a state as such, are actually the legitimate holders of the land, and that a state needs to be created in order to serve their needs. And so like, I mean, I come from the perspective of like, this is actually a point I tried to make with Scott, but I see that this sort of, you guys are anti-war, good. I'm anti-war too, as a general principle. I don't like intervention. I certainly hated what we did in Iraq. But it's like the thing you're criticizing us for, right? Like funding the Kurds and trying to get them to rise up against the existing government and creating this massive civil war. It's like, that's what we've been doing in the international community has been doing in Palestine, or that's what Qatar and all them fund the Palestinians, encourage them to rise up. Like, maybe that's the wrong solution here. Maybe the encouragement should be make peace and like negotiate eventually to get like more and more autonomy as peace continues and as as temperatures cool down.
Let me.
I'll stop there.
Can you address the question I asked of Dave earlier? Is it my analysis incorrect that neither the Israeli government nor Hamas seems to care particularly much for the lives of the Palestinian people in Gaza?
I think it's a matter of degree, right? I think Israel cares more, honestly. I think you obviously care less if you build your if you're building your military fortifications under the city and force them to bomb the city to destroy the military fortifications. And historically, there's been rampant use of human shields by the Palestinians, and I think Israelis, to the extent like they can, they don't care as much. Certainly, post 10/7, they do not care as much about civilian casualties in Gaza as they used to. And so, substantially less indifferent, but not fully invested either would be the way I'd frame it.
Okay, I got a question for Dave. Let's suppose this two-state solution follows through. Hamas was voted in the one time that Gaza had elections. Let's suppose today there's a magic wand and Gaza is recognized as a sovereign state. Do you think that this would lead to more peaceful coexistence between the citizenry in Gaza and Israel as a whole?
Well, it's obviously the devil's in the details there. Like how exactly it gets done is an important aspect to all of this. But look, if you want to look at what really is the problem here, like why is there this problem of constant war between the Palestinians and the Israelis? And if you're going to say, well, it's because they hate Jews or because of radical Islam or something like that, I mean, all of Israel's surrounding countries, I mean, look, they have been at peace with Egypt since the 70s. They've been at peace with Jordan. They've been at peace with Saudi Arabia. They've been at peace with all of these countries that certainly the population's not too fond of Jews, and they have real radical Islam problems in all of those societies. But the difference is that they're not dominated by Israel. They have their independence and they have their autonomy. And so I think we would be much better off in a situation where that was granted to the Palestinians as well. Now, just to Will's point, because it's very interesting, a lot of the stuff you're bringing up, and I agree with much of it. I think that, like if you're coming on Michael Malice's show and saying that, all these lines are drawn in all the wrong places and the nation state is all kind of an illusion anyway. And why shouldn't like different groups of people have the right to kind of secede from that nation state if they want to? I think you're preaching to the choir. And I think that certainly I'm not going to argue with you on that. And I believe in the right of all people to secede from their nations. Now, whether it's strategically a good idea to attempt to do that is kind of a case by case basis. But the point is that it does not follow at all, even under the old colonial model or anything like that, that Israel just has a right to the entire thing. I mean, the British Empire never gave it to Israel. They kicked it over to the United Nations, and the United Nations had no authority to create countries. They gave a recommendation, a partition recommendation, which gave 56% of the land to the Zionists and 44% of it for a Palestinian state. And so what happened, I mean, obviously the Arabs rejected this deal, and for good reason. But then after the Civil War in 1947 and then the war in 1948, Israel won the war and took 80% of it. They took it by war, which is very clearly illegal in international law. You can't get territory through war. And then in 1967, they won another war, and they've maintained, in effect, what you're saying they do have. They have control of the whole thing, because they won it in a war, not because it was given to them by a mandate under the League of Nations, or not because any colonial power decided to give it to them. It's they won it in war and they kept it, and they kicked a whole bunch of people out in the process. And that's the reality of how we got here. So no, I don't think that's a good solution for peace. Look where we are.
I mean, well, that's to me, it's actually a great solution for peace, right? Like Israel accepted the UN partition agreement. Sorry, do you want to go, Malice?
No, I was just agreeing with you. I mean, isn't this the kind of fuck around and find out kind of situation? Like at the end of the day,
Precisely.
when there's two groups, like look at Nazi Germany, something we're going to be much easier on. You guys, let's even pretend Hitler didn't start. Let's pretend Hitler got goaded into the wall. Just steel man this argument. You lose your war, you're going to have consequences, whether it's legal or illegal. That's just literally the story of civilization. But go ahead, Well, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, well, that's right, and I'm not arguing that Israel isn't going to exist anymore, or that all, like if I'm not taking the position that we should give the land back to the Native Americans or that Israel should give all of Israel back to the Palestinians or anything like that. I mean, it's been generations now and people have started lives there. However, it's more like I'm saying you can recognize that what we did to the Native Americans was pretty messed up, and to those Native Americans that still live here, they should have their full natural rights protected.
Sure.
So I'm not even saying like the partition plan is gone. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about the Palestinians getting back 45% of the land. That's never been in any of the negotiations from Camp David to the Oslo Accords to any of them. That's never been what's on the table. What people are talking about now is 67 borders. They're saying that's all that's ever been negotiated for decades on this topic. So it's just saying that it's like, okay, Israel, you won the war. You drove all of these people out of their lands. Understand that that's a big contributing factor to why there's all this hostility. But at this point, you got to give them their 22%. It's way less than the partition recommendation even was. But you got to give that to them and give them their independence and autonomy. And that should be a non-negotiable. And it's also what international law dictates.
Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I guess, as I said, I don't think it's clear at all that international law dictates that. I mean, there might be international lawyers hostile to Israel who believe that that's the right perspective. But I think, as I discussed earlier about the principle of, having claim to the territory of the pre-colonial state, I mean, I think that's the view I have, right? If had Palestine formed a state post the UN resolution, and then after that, like at a later date, had a war, and then Israel would be occupying it. But there never was a Palestinian state. So as far as I'm concerned, there isn't. So international law doesn't mandate anything here. It doesn't mandate Israel give up an inch of the West Bank or an inch of Gaza.
So is it one state then? Is that all part of Israel in your view? Like if you're saying currently there isn't a state, so what is it currently? And by the way, I mean, even the top people in the Israeli government have conceded for years that settlements are a violation of international law. And this is like pretty widely accepted.
It's not as I don't think it's as widely accepted as you think, especially on the Israeli realm.
Okay, but so what is it currently? Is it just all Israel? You know what I'm saying? Like, what are those territories? If Israel has a right to do this there, are you saying that it's because this is all one state? This is all Israel?
It's all part of it. I mean, I think that the proper international law way to do it is all part of Israel.
Okay, I'm glad you concede that. But now here you've got a next really big problem. If the West Bank and Gaza is part of Israel, then by definition, Israel is an apartheid state. These people have no voting rights. They have no rights at all within this government that they're a part of. They're forced to be a part of it, and they're kept separate. It's as clear of an apartheid state as any that's ever existed.
I think apartheid is overstating it, but I think there's the fundamental question of if you don't have voting rights or an apartheid state. I'm not as pro-democracy as everybody else in all circumstances.
None of us are. You're at home here on this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we're all sort of democracy is a means to an end, not an end of itself. Right.
No, but I'm just saying that, look, if you're saying that this is all one state, well then, okay, but this is a state where there's, 5 million people who are completely held as second-class citizens that don't have the right that the people who they recognize as citizens have. I mean, the voting rights is the least of it. There's much more, natural rights that they don't have. But so how exactly, it's like so crazy to me that there's this one carve out for this country, Israel, that it sounds like we're having a debate in like a different time that we would ever accept this from any advanced Western society, that you're like, oh yeah, well, we have this one state and then there's we have all of our citizens and then there's like these few million people who just don't get citizenship or any right and we keep them in these parts of the states living in squalor.
I'm in favor of repealing the 19th Amendment, so that's going to be way more than 5 million people who aren't going to have a right to vote when Texas becomes independent.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be in favor of repealing their rights and keeping them in a certain geographic location in the country.
Well,
would
just
you?
the kitchen.
You're going to be okay with driving everybody out of their homes?
No, they have to stay in their homes. Folks, gold has soared past $2,000 an ounce. The wars in Israel and Ukraine, as well as rate cuts that are on the table, are fueling gold's meteoric rise. Deutsche Bank, UBS, Bank of America, JP Morgan, they're all forecasting sizable rate cuts in an election year. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, Larry Fink of BlackRock, they point out similarities to the 70s. In 1979, we had the Iran hostage crisis, war in the Middle East, and major cities in disarray and stagflation. Gold went from $158 an ounce in 74 to $850 an ounce in 1980. Meanwhile, our national debt is skyrocketing ever higher. There's a direct correlation to the national debt and the price of gold. In 2020, the U.S. debt was $23 trillion. and gold was $1,500 an ounce. In 2023, the national debt is $33 trillion, and gold is over $2,000 an ounce. Donald Trump warned that the U.S. dollar is no longer being the world standard, and that will be our greatest defeat in 200 years. So here's what you can do. Call the proud Americans of the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late. Mention my name. That's Michael Malice. And you'll always get best-in-class service from Patriots protecting Patriots. Patriot Gold Group has the no fee for life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the no fee for life IRA on qualifying rollovers. All you have to do is call 888-505-9845 to get a free investor guide today, or even easier, just go to malicegold.com. Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer 7 years in a row. So just call 888-505-9845 or go to malicegold.com. Protect your money against the Fed and inflation. Your Welcome is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Now, most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to me and whoever this is this week, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now, which is getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy. You can save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Let's get back to the show. Let me ask you a serious, Dave. Let me ask you a serious question, which is this: Isn't I'm surprised to hear you invoke international law, because at the end of the day, do you disagree that international law is by and large a weak measure to adjudicate the morality of a given nation or a given people?
Yeah, generally speaking, I'm not
Okay.
like making a appeal to legality as that if that is the end all be all of morality. But like me and you might both be anarchists, but like if somebody murdered somebody, you might find yourself going like, this is clearly illegal. Like you're not allowed to do that. And
Well,
I do
I
actually like that law. So like that law is pretty good, that you're not allowed to murder people. And like, yeah, the general framework of laws that you're not allowed to like, occupy foreign countries, or that you're not allowed to send your citizens into other countries to change the demographics of them intentionally. There's a lot of international laws that are probably me and you would both agree like, yeah, that's a pretty good rule.
okay.
Probably
I
a
got
pretty good rule that you're not allowed to target civilians.
I've got a question for both of you, which is this: like Thomas Sowell always talks about how there's no solutions, only trade-offs. What would you desire to be done with this population in Gaza, which you both recognize is heavily radicalized? We could point fingers, whoever's radicalizing. The point is, we are where we are today. Would you be in favor of America or other countries taking in Palestinians as refugees? And if not, what do you see as a way forward? I'll start with Will.
I think the first best solution is that they can all go to Qatar, right? Qatar has been a nasty regime that has, been responsible for funding all these people. I think, default one should be, and Qatar is very wealthy too, so they're perfectly capable of handling it. The second one is essentially denazification, right? You basically,
Okay.
I think this is what the Israelis have hinted at. I think after this, I look at what kind of Bukele did in El Salvador with essentially he did things like you're not allowed to have gang signs anymore, like on tombstones. We're basically proscribing the gangs, and we're saying like this is done. You can't even no graffiti, no tombstones, no nothing. You don't get to say this, in the same way that the Germans banned the Nazi symbol, and Nazi salutes and stuff like that. And obviously like couldn't do that in America because we have the First Amendment. But I think in post-defeat countries without a First Amendment that have a large, essentially ideological problem in them, which is essentially the population ascribes to a set of beliefs that is going to continue to like very serious militarism as war and is unacceptable to its neighbors. I think that's the correct solution, essentially, like de-Hamas-ification, right? Like they're, basic, Israel's there and they're like, no black flags, no Hamas insignias, like, and you don't get to publicly advocate for Hamas-like beliefs like that. Those are crimes now. Sorry. Because, and because we're going for a new future here where we're all going to peacefully coexist. And
Wait,
that
but
clear,
hold on, but
allowing that to
won't that,
fester clearly was a really bad thing.
but won't that be a huge incentive for young men now to be like badasses and radicalized? Because if you're making it illegal to like wear just a flag or to like even just say certain things, young men who are, marginalized and like they're low status, and on top of the whole ideology of being a suicide bomber being like the most badass thing you could be, won't that be a great recruitment tool for organizations? They don't have to call themselves Hamas; they call themselves Shamas. Oh, we're completely different. But
Yeah,
now this is going to encourage
I
more.
guess I'll use a word from my old debate background that is non-unique, meaning that already was the status quo, right? The world where like every badass 18-year-old was already being desiring to join Hamas in Gaza. That was the status quo. That's why they have 50,000 under arms. You look at the celebrations post 10/7 and like people, screaming in the streets, like they're already maxed out on that.
I don't think they
And
are.
I mean, if you had said that to Bukele, here's the other thing. Like, if you had said that to Bukele in El Salvador, you could have said the exact same argument, right? Like if you try and like prescribe the gangs, that'll make them super uncool, or that'll make them super cool and rebellious, and so you'll end up with more of a problem than if you had just done nothing. And it turned out, well, actually, that's not the case. Like, you put enough, you're firm enough, you can eradicate the gangs.
I'm not as familiar with Bukele, and Dave, I'll get to you in a second. But I would guess, and I would bet living money, joining a gang is not a status. There's still going to be a stigma, right? Like parents aren't going to be bragging that their kids are joining a gang. Whereas if you have this radicalized population and their kid becomes a suicide bomber or something like that, that's a very different dynamic than when they're joining an organization which inherently is illegal and dedicated to committing crime.
I mean, to a degree, but I mean, the gangs are so endemic in El Salvadoran society there's less stigma. I think that's, if you actually
Okay.
look at that, that's true of many sort of contra states, or I'm sorry, like the narco states rather, is that the social stigma for joining a gang goes way down. Like
Okay.
true in Colombia in the era of the drug lords, and true elsewhere too.
So, Dave, let me ask you the
Yeah,
question
well,
asked Will, which is: are you in favor of
sure.
either like Samasol? There's no solutions, only trade-offs. Should the U.S. or other nations take in Palestinians as refugees? And if not, like what's a good way forward?
Well, certainly
Assuming,
not the United States of America. That
okay,
just makes no sense, and we already have a major problem with our border crisis here, and we take in more than anyone else in the world just legally. Not even talking about how many are coming in illegally, which I think none of us actually know how many. But the number is pretty staggeringly high, and so no, it doesn't make any sense for them to come halfway around the world to a completely different culture. Like I just don't see that at all. I do think that there is almost when it comes to the idea of like who should take these people in, there's almost a premise there that I find somewhat flawed, which is that it's almost like, well, they got to go, they have to go somewhere else, and I don't think they have to. I think that they should have a right to stay there, and it's not, I don't think, reasonable for the Israeli government, as they've done several times in the last few weeks, to say like essentially, like, hey, world, help us ethnically cleanse this area. Everybody's got to do their fair part in taking them in. They can go live in your country. We just can't have them living next to ours. Now, to the El Salvador example, the obvious major difference there is that this is not being done by a foreign government. This is being done by their own government. And not now, I'm a pure radical libertarian. In theory, I don't think it should matter whether your own government is oppressing you or a foreign government is oppressing you. But in reality, that does make a huge difference. It's like an example that Horton used to like to use a lot was the idea of like, imagine we were a free country. And so there's no income tax because we're free people. And then the Soviet Union invaded and conquered us. And then they established the USSIRS. And they announced that it's a crime now to be a productive member of society. And the punishment is a fee. And we're going to be collecting half your salary. And you could imagine the type of resistance there would have been to that compare to the fact that, like, when our own government does it to us, we all, for the most part, people go, well, that's the price of living in a society. When it's done by a foreign government, the idea that Israel just hasn't dominated these people enough, and if they really started dominating them more, then we wouldn't have this problem. It not only flies in the face of all of the lessons that should have been learned throughout this entire conflict, but I'm just saying that, again, even at the highest levels of the Israeli government, for years, they have admitted to their own people that they don't hate us for our freedom or hate us for our Jewishness. They really hate us because of what we do to them. And I'm not saying that there's no amount of hatred over just Jew hatred, but that is not the major driving factor here. And there's a great and by the way, I got this from your boy Daryl Cooper, but there's this great eulogy that Moshe Dayan gave. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Well,
I know Diane, but I don't remember the eulogy.
So Moshe Dayan, who is most famously known for being the defense minister during the 1967 war, but he held lots of different high-level positions in the government of Israel. So it was in 1956, there was an Israeli lieutenant who got murdered by a few Arabs right outside of Gaza, and Moshe Dayan gave the eulogy at his funeral, and he goes off on this whole thing where he's like, it's pretty amazing. He's like, let us not blame the murderers. Why should we resent them for hating us? We would hate us too if we were in their positions. And this is pretty new. This is 8 years into the creation of the state of Israel. And he's like, look, for 8 years, they've been living in refugee camps while we're building this nation where they and their fathers and grandfathers once lived. We're right here shoving it in their face. That's why they hate us, and that's why they're going to hate us. Now, he was, of course, is still saying this from a pro-Israeli perspective. But he was very clear about why it is that they're hated all the way back then. I think it was Barak who had said that if he was a young Arab, he would join a terrorist organization also. We talk a lot about like what Israel has a right to do to defend themselves. But again, I don't think any of us have addressed like what exactly do Palestinians have the right to do? What do they have a right to do? I mean, if you're saying like, well, we're going to never give you your independence and we're going to continue to dominate you, do they have a right to resist that? If we're saying like, as Michael said earlier, he said, fuck around, find out. If it is just kind of like this, well, might makes right and Israel has the might, therefore they can dominate you, then what is a reasonable response from those Palestinians? I think this is how you end up with October 7th, is that they say, okay, well, this is the only thing this is the language we're talking now. Who can kill more of the other side?
Right, but okay, then if that's the language, then then that's the end of the complaining about Israeli war crimes, right? Like, to me, it's like
it's the end of complaining about October 7th too.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, but then that's where we are. We're in full might makes right world, right? And Israel has the might. Okay. Right.
Yeah, but okay, fine. So if but again, that's not my position. But if that's the position you're taking, then you can't cry about October 7th. You don't get to sit here and go, oh no, but they killed all these innocent people, because you're not in that game anymore. Now, the thing about what I'm saying is that the reason why I'm a Western chauvinist, the reason why the Western civilization is the best, is precisely because that's not our attitude. That we don't just believe that like, oh, you can do whatever you want to whatever group of people, you can dominate them if you're stronger than them. The whole idea, the best part of Western civilization was a recognition that it's like, oh no, we actually believe in civilization and in peace and in natural rights, and that governments are supposed to be built in order to protect those natural rights. Now, there's a lot of bullshit in there, but at least there was paying some homage to the idea that like, we're not just barbarians, we're the civilized ones. So we don't get to treat these people in the most barbaric fashion and then also claim it's okay because we're not the barbarians.
Well,
right. I mean, I guess there's a number of things I could answer there. I don't think that Israel's being nearly as barbaric as being framed. I think, I guess I look at it this way, right? You do something as barbaric as 10-7. I'm not interested in hearing about any of your claims, right? Like my view of 10-7 broadly is like, if you're like 10-7 was really barbaric and horrible, but it's like, I don't want to hear the but anymore, because the but just, I mean, as we talked about earlier, sort of essentially validates the underlying tactic. And I think ultimately like what the Palestinians ought do is make peace, right? First priority, like imagine, okay, so there was one point I wanted to get back to, which is in particular, you said, well, the difference between El Salvador and Israel is that El Salvador is not being governed by a foreign government, right? Israel would be imposing the rule in Gaza, as a foreign government. Well, that's what the United States did in Germany and Japan, right? We imposed unconditional surrender on those countries, defeated them entirely, denazified them, imposed martial law until and squelched out the underlying ideology of the adversary, and those are now peaceful contributing countries in the world. I think if you ultimately want an actual resolution to the Israel-Gaza conflict, it is essentially that. It is the unconditional surrender of Hamas and the denazification of the Gaza Strip. And then that's ultimately can lead to like peaceful coexistence and a world where over time Gaza is granted more and more autonomy, in a world where they are not attacking Israel, where they are not bombing things. And it's like as unfair as the origins of Israel were for the existing Palestinian residents back in 1947. You've pressed that claim 3 or 4 times at this point and lost. From a perspective of like wanting to minimize war, I just think that claim shouldn't be validated anymore. Like at a certain point, you keep pressing that claim and losing and starting new wars and engaging in terrorism, and 1, getting nowhere, not actually achieving your goals, and 2, getting more and more barbaric as time goes on. Like we shouldn't validate that.
Okay, I got a question. I got a question for each of you. Quick question for Dave. Do you disagree with this premise that as part of the peace accords, as the Israelis have given the residents of Gaza more freedom and more liberty, they haven't gotten more peaceful, they've gotten more violent and been exploiting that freedom in order to wage a low-key war against Israel? Do you think that's inaccurate?
Well, yeah, I think it is pretty inaccurate. And actually, after Israel pulled their military presence out of Gaza, but put this full blockade around the country, by many metrics, things got worse for the people of Gaza. And the other element of this, which Will alluded to earlier, but we didn't really discuss, is that, and then in those years, it was like Israeli policy to prop up Hamas. And Netanyahu has said this many times in his own words. There was just a big piece in the New York Times about it on Sunday. There's been major pieces in Times of Jerusalem and Haaretz. And of course, I recommend people go to antiwar.com. You can read Scott Horton and Connor Friedman had a really fantastic piece about it, all sourced with that. This was, in Netanyahu's own words, the plan was to keep Hamas in power because no one would ever recognize the independence of Gaza as long as Hamas was in power. So they intentionally wanted to put the most radical terrorist group and keep them in power there in order to make negotiations for any type of Palestinian state at any point impossible. And so it's not as simple as like Israel gave them more freedom and what they did with this freedom was become more radical. There's actually a much more complex picture. And in fact, Israel was supporting the most radical elements of it, of the people in Gaza, for their own political ends. And those political ends were to make sure they never had to give the people of Gaza their independence.
Let me ask a question of Will. Do you not see that there's an impression many people have that October 7th gave the Netanyahu government a pretext, in the same way that September 11th gave George W. Bush a pretext to invade Iraq, which he'd been talking about before the events of September 11th? Do you not see that it gave the Netanyahu government a pretext to go in and do what they wanted, which is basically just level Gaza and just completely make it ineffectual and uninhabitable?
I don't think that's right, because they've had so many circumstances in the past decade that could have served as pretexts if that's what they really wanted to do. I mean, I think of like the kidnapping of a soldier or the kidnapping of a few Israeli teenagers. Right, those are the previous events that led to some military action, but not like full blown multi-month military action. So I don't think that. I think rather, and I mean that's a hell of a pretext, right? If butchering 1,200 people isn't a casus belli, I don't know what is. That's a pretty dramatic, attempt to kick off a war. So I don't think there's anything. It's not like a Gulf of Tonkin situation. There's nothing, unless you're one of these crazy people who thinks it's all fake. Like it was pretty real. I should have written down what you said, Dave, because I forgot I already forgot about it in answering the question.
I'm gonna. Is that everything, Will? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's everything.
By the way, my guest next week, we're recording tomorrow, assuming she doesn't reschedule again, will be Meghan McCain. So hopefully she'll be bringing some sanity to this debate, which none of us have, and we can just sit and learn at her feet. I will encourage everyone to go to malice.locals.com, where both Dave and Will be answering supporter questions. I have one last question for Dave. Do you deny that Israel is under the control of Zog, a Zionist-occupied government, and that the Jews are running that whole country? Can you still deny that after all these years?
Was that actually a question from a fan, or is that just coming from you? That's just your question.
I dare you to deny Israel... the Jews are running Israel. I dare you.
I think it's a fair statement that the Jews are running Israel. Yeah, I think that part of it's true. I think I'm much more in seriousness with all that stuff. I don't think like the idea that like Israel is, you know, the puppet master and like the American empire is almost like run by Israel, I think is kind of silly. And then I think much more the case is that America is the empire and Israel is kind of one of our satellites. But there's influence from both sides. But
sure.
The Jews do have disproportionate control of Israel. That's true.
Yeah. Will, can you admit, yes. Can you admit that as well, Will? You can see that point.
The Jews have disproportionate control of Israel. I think that's the entire point. I think that's the whole point of the statement.
I'm glad we could end this discussion on a point that we all agree with. Gentlemen, we're running out of time. Dave, what was Will's favorite part of this episode?
Will's favorite part of this episode was as soon as you started talking, he just felt right at home, listening to the beautiful voice of Michael Malice.
Happy Hanukkah.
I'm Walter Masterson.
And I'm Maximilian Clark.
And we're basically journalists.
No, we're not.
Well, we do travel across America and interview people.
Yeah, using God to solve murders, and it's proven communication.
Tell me everything about that.
But we also dress up like extremists and sneak into their protests.
I care about children. That is why I pay my court-mandated child support.
Well, that's undercover journalism.
Okay, and that time we pretended to be Trump's legal team during the indictment?
Trump loves America. He considers us all family. That's why he's always asking us for money.
Okay, so we are not journalists. We're TikTok comedians asking questions real journalists are too smart to ask.
But we also talk to real experts and scientists and smart people and stuff.
And make fun of them.
Yeah, I guess that's why we named our show We Are Not Journalists.
Because we're better. We have a podcast.
A podcast that's available on whatever podcast app you use to get your podcasts.
Podcast.
Hold on to your jingle bells. Pluto TV has all your holiday favorites for free. Enjoy Christmas classics like Scrooge with Bill Murray or Last Holiday with Queen Latifah. Plus, dive into festive channels like Holiday Movie Favorites by Lifetime or Hallmark Movies and more. Download the Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming holiday favorites on live channels and on demand. With thousands of free movies and TV shows, Pluto TV is your home for the holidays. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.